Hey everyone, Rose here, and welcome back to another painting. This painting is quite personal to me. I worked on it for almost a year and on several different devices, so the time-lapse is a little bit shaky and missing a few sections, especially the sketch in the very beginning. But I think the process is still pretty interesting to watch, and I'm going to take the time to talk about the history of the painting and some of my thoughts behind it. So, like the title says, I've had the idea for this painting in my head for several years at this point. Definitely pre-pandemic, which is why it's at least 3 years, but honestly probably even longer. I made a couple of sketches in my notebook for it here and there, and sometimes even looked online for some references, but it didn't really go anywhere because the idea just seemed a bit too complicated to actually do well. Usually when I have an idea like this that I don't feel like I can actually execute properly, it just swirls around in my head for a while and I eventually abandon it. Or even when I do make some thumbnail sketches or start looking up references, I end up realizing that the concept I had in my head doesn't actually translate into a visual image very well, because I can't really form full pictures in my head. This specific idea was different though. It never really faded away, like I never really lost interest in it, even though I kept pushing it off because I figured that I wouldn't actually be able to get it to look good. Like, part of me just really wanted to see the painting exist. So eventually, back in November, I finally started working on it. And yes, that's November of last year. I spent almost a year working on this painting. To be fair, I started film school last summer and I've been really busy with school projects. I also started running a game of D&D, so I've been using a lot of my art brain for that, plus working on commissions to make a little bit of money. So I haven't had much time and I was really working on it on and off, like for a couple of hours when I had time in between other stuff. I finally finished working on the painting in mid-September, and now I finally had time to record the voiceover and upload the video for it. I think the reason this idea was so stubborn is ultimately linked to how long I've hung on to Blaze as a character and how important she is to me. I've mentioned this before in videos about her, but of all the characters I have, she's the one I've drawn the most and is probably one of the ones that I've had for the longest with the least amount of changes. Like, I have little sketches of her in my middle school homework calendars, and while her design has gone through some tweaks, her overall vibe has stayed pretty consistent. Blaze as a character reflects a lot of things about me, some of them more superficial, like the fact that I like cats, and especially big cats, and the color combo of black and red and fantasy creatures. But also some more like personal things, my anxieties and insecurities, and just some of the things that make me feel warm and cozy. I'm a very introverted person and I struggle with some social anxieties, so a lot of the little stories and snippets I make up in my head around her center around themes of like friendship and loneliness. There's this frustration of fear of missing out and actually wanting to spend time with friends and form deep friendships, but also feeling stressed and awkward every time you're around people and just being really exhausted afterwards. Or the feeling of loneliness when you're in a crowd, because even though you're surrounded by people you actually like being around, for some reason in the moment you aren't really connecting with anyone, and so you're in this awkward position where you're not really connecting with people around you, but you're also not like alone in your personal comfy space. Or there's that weird awkwardness of attaching yourself to the one person you know in a major social event so that you have kind of an anchor point. But there's also the friendships you find and build where you do feel safe and comfy just hanging around and chilling and you don't feel exhausted afterwards. Or the group events that are really fun and exciting the whole time, and even though you are completely exhausted after it, it always feels worth it. And I think most importantly, there's just the learning to understand and accept yourself and your needs, and realizing that the people who really care about you aren't gonna be upset at you for not participating in everything, because they understand that you need your own space a lot of the time. I've never really done anything with Blaze's story. At some point I started writing down her backstory, but I never really went anywhere with it. It's a relatively straightforward, ugly duckling, fish out of water kind of setup, with Blaze being this creature called a saberhorn, which is essentially a type of unicorn, but generally more cat-like in terms of how they're built and how they behave. And she's raised and grew up around this herd of unicorns, which are these very graceful social creatures that just work in a very different way, and they of course have this complicated relationship. And then there's Snowdrop, which is in this painting the one unicorn that's actually directly touching her, and he sort of has this older brother sort of relationship with her, or close friend, and he's kind of the one character or person that forms this bridge between her and the rest of the herd. I've made some paintings of Snowdrop in the past as well, actually, and he turns up in some of the paintings I have of Blaze. If there's just one random unicorn somewhere in close proximity to her, or in the background of a painting of her, that's Snowdrop. His name has changed a couple of times, though. I knew I wanted him to be called something involving snow, but I was never quite sure. The most recent iteration, I think, was Snowbell, but that doesn't quite have the vibe. I'm not sure about Snowdrop yet either. Might change in the future, who knows. The other unicorns currently don't really have names. They don't serve as much of an individual purpose in her story as much as more of a collective role, and that's sort of how I went about designing them in this particular painting as well. And speaking of that, that's pretty much it for the background history of the painting, so on to the painting itself. One of the interesting things about this painting in particular is that the composition is unbelievably simple. It's arguably one of the most simple compositions a painting could possibly have. It's literally a square image that's mostly white with a mostly black focal point right in the center. In fact, usually you'd want to try and avoid something like this to try and create a bit more dynamic movement in a painting. However, despite the composition being so simple, the actual process of making it work and actually maintaining it throughout the painting was pretty difficult. I really wanted all the white unicorns to sort of function as one turbulent mass for the background rather than a bunch of individuals, so I had to take a lot of time with the posing to make sure that they're all organized in a way that doesn't create any lines leading into a wrong direction or doesn't call attention to any one or any cluster of them. But of course, I had to balance that with actually making them work as individuals, making sure their proportions made somewhat sense and their poses were kind of reasonable. And of course, the way they were touching each other and interacting had to somehow work, preferably in a way that there is a minimum amount of space in between them where you could see the ground. So as you can probably tell, even though this time-lapse doesn't even include the initial rough sketch, I had to spend a huge amount of time on the refined sketch, making sure all of those interactions, all of those proportions worked on, I think it's a total of around 30 individual characters in this painting. If you look back on my art, you'll notice that I rarely have images with multiple characters together, and even then, they're almost never physically interacting. So jumping straight to a painting that had 30 different unicorns all huddled together was just a challenge based on that. And then there was the additional challenge that it's, unicorns, so they have this sort of weird mixed anatomy between horses and deer, which are both unbelievably difficult in terms of their anatomy, and then also it's from an angle that's really unusual. Like, I couldn't find a single reference image of just like a herd of horses sleeping, but from like a drone view, so I had to kind of figure that out myself. It was a lot. Fortunately, I got most of that figured out during the sketch, so I only had to make minor tweaks while doing the rendering. That being said, rendering wasn't super easy either. Fortunately, it wasn't as much of an extra challenge as the sketching, but there were quite a few difficulties there too. A huge challenge for this one was layer management, actually. Not necessarily something you would immediately think about, but usually I have a sort of system where I keep each individual element of the painting in its own group layer, so that way within that layer I can add all the multiply and line art and whatever elements I need, while keeping all of that nice and bundled away and separate from all the other parts, so that I can easily turn things on and off to check how stuff is working, move stuff around, adjust the outlines without affecting things behind it, all that good stuff. Now, for this painting that worked with Blaze and Snowdrop in the middle, but for all the unicorns in the background, there was no way to keep each of them as a separate layer because of just how they overlapped with each other and everything. I had kept them separate in the sketch because that was kind of important to be able to move them around and pose them and occasionally even duplicate them, so that I didn't have to draw all of them from scratch. But as soon as I started painting and having all these overlapping pieces, I was a little bit lost on how to go about it. What I eventually decided on was to just merge all of them down into one big unicorn mess layer, and then add additional layers for things like the manes and tails that I'd also gradually merge down as I was like solid on how they looked. Another possibly kind of surprising challenge for this one was the lighting. I knew from the very beginning that I wanted overcast lighting. I didn't want any kind of stark light coming from any specific direction. I essentially wanted it to look like a sort of daytime-ish scene with overcast clouds, so that it's just diffuse lighting coming from up top from the same angle that the camera kind of is coming from. Now, that might not seem like a huge challenge just on the surface, but really having a very specific light source that comes in at some angle relative to the camera is really, really helpful in defining your forms in a painting like this. So not having something like that meant I had to rely entirely on like glossiness for three-dimensionality, as well as ambient occlusion. For those who aren't familiar with the term, ambient occlusion is essentially the shadows you get in places, in like small cracks, especially in between objects or under objects, where your soft ambient light that's bouncing all over the place can't get into. So in this case, ambient occlusion means in between all the unicorns in these small spaces where you can barely see down to the ground, most of the light bouncing around from the snow and the sky, and the other unicorns just can't get into those corners, and so those corners are darker. Outside of just the content of the painting, another thing that made it a bit more tedious was actually the process itself. Usually, like I've mentioned in some of my past videos, I don't go into too much detail in my sketch, so that way, while I'm rendering and adding in the small details there, the sketch just automatically disappears. In this case, because I had to go into detail in the sketch to get all those proportions and interactions right, I then had to take extra time specifically to get the sketch back out of the painting, which is always a little bit annoying to have to do. This all kind of makes it sound like the entire process was a huge pain and I hated all of it. That's not at all true. There was a lot about the process that I actually really enjoyed. One thing is I'm actually a huge fan of painting whites and grays. A lot of my art is very colorful, and I'm really a huge fan of color, but one of the really fun things about painting things that are very desaturated is that you can add a bunch of different colors into them. So if you have something like the unicorns that are white and gray, you can mix in purplish grays, and you can mix in reddish grays, and you can mix in greenish and bluish. You can go all around the color wheel and just pick really desaturated colors and just splotch them around, and it's really fun and relaxing to do, especially if you have some nice brushes that have some like color variation and jitter or a nice bit of texture and thickness to them. It's really relaxing and fun to just see all of that come together. Another thing that was nice about it is that because of this simple composition, you could tell relatively quickly that it was coming together and that the whole thing worked. So as soon as I had the most basic sketch in and I could lay in some flat whites and grays and the green and dark gray for the middle, I could already tell that the overall composition worked when I zoomed out. So even when there were times where it felt tedious and boring to do all the nitty-gritty rendering work or fixing of proportions, I could always zoom out the whole image and turn on my colored layers and know, even though it kind of feels garbage right now, I know that the thing as a whole works. I also really enjoyed having this frame around the painting for some reason. It really was only there for a very practical reason, which is that in order for me to make sense of the proportions of all the unicorns, I essentially had to continue the sketch beyond where I wanted the edge of the painting to be, and so I made this frame to mark out what's part of the painting and what's just there as a guide. But having it there in the overview and just zooming out and occasionally seeing it sort of made the whole thing feel fancier. I might actually just start adding frames like that to my paintings in the future, both as like a practical guide, but also just for fun to make it feel fancier. I also had a lot of fun with this grass and the tiny little details in the fur and mane and tails of all the unicorns. I don't think I've ever really painted grass textures like this. I've done fur occasionally, but it was fun really seeing that flat green surface or the flat white surfaces of the manes just suddenly pop to life with just a few extra strokes of my random pencil brush. For those wondering why there's just like a random patch of grass in the middle, I've kind of touched on it earlier, but Saber Horns and Blaze by extension has sort of fire-related magic. She also understandably isn't like a huge fan of lying in wet snow, so she's just heated up a bit and melted all the snow around her and dried out this little patch of grass so she can sleep comfortably. The sort of lore background of the painting is that because she's so warm, she's just essentially like this radiator that the entire group is gathered and huddled around for warmth, but the only one who's actually close enough to her to actually fully cuddle up next to her, of course, is Snowdrop. And at this point of the time-lapse, I am wrapping up the painting. I'm making the last few tweaks here and there before it's all done. Like with a lot of artworks, this isn't really one that's finished as much as I decided that this was the place to stop. I could easily spend 20 or 30 more hours going around it and refining even more details, fixing proportions, making the anatomy better, all that, and I might go back and do some of that in the future. But especially with how busy I've been recently, I decided that doing more work now beyond this would just be diminishing returns. And so, it's done. And here it is. After 10 months of on and off work and a lot of frustration, it's done. And I love it. It's so cool to finally see this idea that I've had swimming around in my head as a fully formed image. Like I mentioned earlier, I can't really picture full images in my head. I don't fully have aphantasia, I do have a mind's eye, it's just mostly blind. And so it's really frustrating to have this idea, this concept in your head, and to almost be able to see it and almost catch glimpses of it, but never have this full image until you actually go out and make it. And I finally did, and it looks as good as I'd hoped it would look. And that makes me really happy. Now, you might expect me to say something like, oh, I wish I had just gone for it sooner and trusted myself, or I wish I hadn't pushed it off that far. But actually, I don't feel that way. This might seem a bit weird, and is probably like not really that great advice, but I'm glad I did it now and I waited this long instead of doing it right when I had the idea. My painting ability has improved a lot over the past few years, and I think while I am at a place now where I'm happy with the result, I'm not sure if back in, say, 2019 or 2020, I would have been happy with the painting that I got. And because this is such a personal piece and one that's so complicated and took so long, I'm not sure if it's the kind of artwork that I would necessarily remake. I think the conclusion here isn't to just push off artworks and not make them till you feel absolutely 100% ready. I didn't feel 100% ready when I started working on it. I think my conclusion is more just hang on to little sparks that turn up, or ideas that keep popping up, or things that move something in you, even if you don't feel like you're immediately ready to do something with them. If you bite off more than you can chew too early, you're gonna get disappointed and frustrated with the thing you're trying to do. But if you just throw everything away that seems difficult, you're gonna miss out on making a lot of things that are really beautiful. For me right now, actually having finished this piece has kind of inspired me to dig up some of the other ideas that I had filed away somewhere. Because if I actually manage to do this, then those other ones don't seem nearly as unachievable as they have in the past. So if you want to see some of the other paintings that have been stewing in the back of my brain for a while, definitely stick around. They might be coming up sometime soon, who knows? Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video and the painting itself. If you really like the painting or want to support me, I'm selling prints now of this painting and a couple of others. There's a link to the print shop in the description below. If there's an artwork of mine you'd like prints of that isn't on there, let me know in the comments somewhere. I just haven't really been sure of what I should or shouldn't put up there. Anyway, that's been all for me for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you all next time. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that stuff. And take a look down in the description below. There's links to all my other social media, as well as my commission info and my print shop. Bye!